Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Let's jump right in and look at the plains of Siffin.
Yeah, located in modern-day Syria, the year is 657.
And this landscape is just soaked in blood. We have two massive armies that are entirely exhausted, and they're locked in this brutal stalemate.
The historical chronicles actually refer to this specific event as the Night of Clamor.
Right, because the fighting in the pitch black is so relentless and chaotic. The noise of clashing swords and dying men is just deafening.
I mean, commanders cannot even issue orders. It's that loud.
Exactly. And then as the sun begins to rise, one side makes a highly calculated, unprecedented move. The soldiers of Muawiyah the first take copies of the Quran, they tie the holy text to the ends of their spears, and they hoist them high into the air above the battlefield.
Which is such a striking visual. The sacred text elevated on the very weapons meant to inflict death.
It is. It remains one of the most heavily analyzed symbols in early Islamic history. It was an undeniable appeal to halt the bloodshed.
By raising the Qurans, Muawiyah's forces were basically shouting across the battlefield, let God decide between us.
Right. It was a demand to force arbitration based on divine law rather than military strength. And, well, it worked. The fighting stopped.
So today we're doing a deep dive into the Umayyad Caliphate. This is the second major Islamic caliphate and the very first hereditary Arab dynasty.
They ruled from 661 to 750.
And the mission of this deep dive is to synthesize the provided theses, which range from historical chronicles to economic analyses, to construct a comprehensive picture of how the Umayyads built this massive empire.
We are talking about a state covering 15 million square kilometers.
It is massive. We are going to explore how they forged a completely new Islamic administrative identity, basically out of thin air.
And how they ultimately fell apart due to profound internal contradictions.
Well, right. So if you have ever wondered how a local tribal structure rapidly evolved into a sprawling, multi-continental bureaucratic state, we are going to look at the exact mechanics of that transformation.
But to understand how Muawiyah even got to a position where he could challenge a caliph on the battlefield with Qurans on spears, we need to back up.
Yeah, who exactly were the Umayyads before they became this imperial powerhouse?
Well, to understand the Umayyads, or the Banu Umayyah as they were known, you have to look at the pre-Islamic context of Mecca.
Because they were a highly influential clan within the larger Quraysh tribe.
Precisely. Long before the caliphate or even the formal establishment of Islam existed, the Umayyads, largely under the leadership of a man named Abu Sufyan, they dominated the region's trade.
Right, they controlled the prosperous caravan networks that ran north into Syria.
So they were wealthy, politically connected, and deeply invested in the status quo of Meccan society.
Which explains why they were initially the principal opponents of the Prophet Muhammad.
Exactly.
Because he was preaching a message that directly challenged the social and economic hierarchies that the Umayyads controlled.
They fought bitterly against the early Muslim community. However, their political calculus shifted entirely in the year 630.
During the conquest of Mecca.
Right. When it became clear that the Muslim forces were going to take the city, Abu Sufyan and the entire Umayyad clan just submitted.
They converted to Islam en masse.
And that rapid pivot always stands out in the historical record. It wasn't just a reluctant surrender where they were pushed to the margins of this new society.
No, they were integrated into the new order almost immediately. I mean, Muawiyah himself, who was Abu Sufyan's son, actually took on the role of a scribe for the Prophet Muhammad.
I'm toss on that. In 7th century Arabia, being a scribe was a massive advantage.
Because literacy was relatively rare among the Quraysh at that time.
Exactly. By serving as a scribe, Muawiyah embedded himself directly in the administrative machinery of the nascent Muslim community.
He's recording revelations, writing diplomatic correspondence, and, learning the inner workings of how this new religious and political entity functioned.
It was essentially an apprenticeship in statecraft.
And that apprenticeship pays off significantly during the Rashidun era, which is the period of the first 4 caliphs who ruled after the Prophet's death.
It does. Caliph Umar recognized the administrative competence of the Umayyad clan. So he appointed Muawiyah's older brother, Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan, as the governor of Syria.
But then Yazid dies the plague in 639.
Right. And Umar transfers that crucial governorship directly to Muawiyah. This is the pivotal moment.
Because Muawiyah spends the next 20 years turning Syria into an impenetrable personal power base.
He utilized the region's existing agricultural wealth and its strategic position to build a highly disciplined standing army.
We are talking about 40,000 to 60,000 troops.
And these weren't just irregular tribal levies. This was a professionalized force, primarily drawn from loyal Arab tribes who had settled in Syria.
And because his tenure was uninterrupted for 2 decades, he consolidated all these military and financial resources completely independent of the capital in Medina.
Which brings us to the spark that ignites the crisis. In 656, Caliph Uthman is assassinated.
And Uthman was himself an Umayyad.
Right, he was killed right in his home in Medina by mutinous soldiers. This throws the entire state into absolute chaos.
Ali ibn Abi Talib is elected as the new caliph, but Muawiyah flat out refuses to pledge allegiance to him.
Muawiyah's refusal was framed entirely around the issue of justice for the murdered caliph. He demanded vengeance for Uthman.
He claimed the right as his Wali al-Dam, which translates to the Avenger of Blood.
This concept of the Avenger of Blood feels very rooted in pre-Islamic tribal justice.
It carried profound legal and cultural weight. Arab tribal custom demanded that the family of a murdered individual seek justice or exact retribution.
Otherwise, the clan's honor was irreparably stained.
Right. So Muawiyah argued that until Ali punished Uthman's assassins, some of whom were actually in Ali's camp or supporting his claim to the caliphate, Ali could not demand the allegiance of the Umayyads.
It was a perfectly calibrated political argument wrapped in an undeniable cultural obligation.
Which brings us right back to the Battle of Siffin in 657. Muawiyah marches his well-funded Syrian army out to confront Ali.
The battle grinds down into the night of clamor, the Qurans go up on the spears, and the fighting stops.
And this leads to the arbitration at Dumat al-Jandal in 658.
The sources suggest this arbitration was a catastrophic political misstep for Ali.
Because the very act of entering into arbitration implicitly lowered his status.
Exactly. Before the arbitration, Ali was the recognized caliph dealing with a rebellious provincial governor.
But by agreeing to have representatives sit down and debate who should rightfully lead the community, he effectively conceded that the leadership was up for debate.
He was reduced from a sovereign to a mere factional leader. It legitimized Muawiyah as an equal.
Furthermore, it alienated a fiercely staunch segment of Ali's own supporters.
Right, these individuals believed that the outcome of the battle should have been left to God's will on the battlefield.
They argued that submitting a divine mandate to human arbitration was a grave sin. So this faction seceded from Ali's camp.
And they became known as the Kharijites, meaning those who go out.
The fallout from that secession is fatal. It is a Kharijite who ultimately assassinates Ali a few years later in 61.
Following the assassination, Ali's son Hassan technically assumes the caliphate.
But he looks at the board, sees the sheer military and financial superiority of Muawiyah's Syrian forces, and makes a very pragmatic choice.
Hassan abdicates.
He accepts a pension and retires to Medina, leaving Muawiyah the first to assume the caliphate completely undisputed.
But this sequence of events raises a massive question. The caliphate up to this point was ostensibly a consultative, consensus-based position among the leadership in Medina.
Right, so how did the wider Muslim leadership justify accepting a hereditary monarchy created by a former rival of the Prophet?
The historical consensus points to exhaustion.
The community had just endured the first fitna, a devastating civil war that pitted former companions of the Prophet against one another.
The leadership acquiesced largely out of sheer pragmatism. Muawiyah possessed the overwhelming military force and the financial capital necessary to restore order.
They needed to keep the trade routes open and secure the frontiers.
So their acceptance was not an endorsement of a hereditary principle at that exact moment. It was a practical, necessary acceptance of the only leader capable of unifying the fractured territories.
They needed the bleeding to stop, and Muawiyah was the only one with enough bandages.
But moving from a consultative leadership, or shura, to a dynastic monarchy required a completely new way of governing.
You cannot run an empire of this scale like a city-state in the desert anymore.
That is the central administrative challenge the Umayyads faced. To signal this shift, Muawiyah's first major move was geographic.
Right, he decided to keep the capital in Damascus.
He didn't move to Medina, which was the traditional religious heartland, and he didn't move to Kufa in Iraq, where Ali had based his rule.
He stayed in Syria, and by staying in Damascus, Muawiyah effectively shifted the center of gravity of the entire Islamic world away from the Arabian Peninsula.
Damascus was a cosmopolitan city, heavily influenced by centuries of Roman and Byzantine administration.
It was situated perfectly to manage the Mediterranean trade and coordinate military campaigns.
But governing from Damascus necessitated building a robust bureaucratic infrastructure. The Umayyads needed to formalize the state.
This is where we see the establishment of the diwans, the government departments.
The sources outline several key ministries that formed the backbone of the Umayyad state.
First, they established the Diwan al-Rasail and the Diwan al-Qatam.
The Diwan al-Rasail was the board of correspondence. It handled all official state communications, diplomatic letters, and administrative orders sent to the provinces.
And to ensure the integrity of these communications, they created the Diwan al-Qatam, which was the chancellery of seals.
Now, you might wonder why dedicate an entire government department just to sealing documents. Was forgery really that significant of a threat?
Well, it was a severe vulnerability.
Yeah, in a massive empire where a governor might be stationed months away from the capital, a forged letter authorizing the release of funds or the movement of troops could be disastrous.
So the Diwan al-Qatam created a system where every official document was copied, and the original was bound and sealed with wax bearing the caliph's specific insignia.
It was a crucial step in centralizing authority and ensuring that the caliph's word was authentic when it arrived at the frontiers.
That makes a lot of sense. And speaking of reaching the frontiers, they also established the Diwan al-Barid.
This is often described as a postal service, but the sources indicate it was modeled directly on older Byzantine systems and served a much more complex function.
Calling it a postal service definitely undersells its importance.
The Diwan al-Barid was an extensive network of relay stations placed at specific intervals along the major roads of the empire.
They kept fresh horses and riders ready at these stations, allowing state communications to travel at speeds impossible for normal merchants or armies.
It is essentially an 8th century pony express.
Mechanically, yes, but its primary function was intelligence gathering.
It allowed the caliph in Damascus to closely monitor the actions of the provincial governors.
Right. The masters of the Barid in the provinces reported directly to the caliph, bypassing the local governors entirely.
They reported on taxation levels, military readiness, and any signs of rebellion. It was the eyes and ears of the central government.
So the caliph knows what is happening, and he can prove his orders are authentic. But none of that matters if he cannot enforce those orders.
That brings us to the most critical department, the Diwan al-Jund.
The Diwan al-Jund was the military registry.
Prior to this, the military was largely a tribal levy system, where warriors fought alongside their clans and were compensated through the spoils of war.
The Umayyads formalized this by creating a central registry that tracked regular stipends for the Arab troops.
They transitioned from a militia into a professional standing army paid directly in cash by the central treasury,
which centralized the loyalty of the military. The troops were no longer just fighting for their tribal leaders, they were employees of the state.
To manage the sheer geographic scale of the empire, the Umayyads divided the conquered territories into massive viceroyalties.
Like Iraq, Egypt, and Hijaz.
And these vast regions were governed by emirs who wielded incredibly broad military and fiscal authority.
But giving a single emir control over all of Iraq sounds like a recipe for rebellion. How did the central government maintain control over these powerful viceroys?
It was a delicate balance of decentralized administration and highly monitored enforcement.
Muawiyah relied heavily on fiercely loyalist tribes, particularly the Banu Kalb in Syria, to form the core of his power.
He also established the Shurta.
Right, the Shurta was a specialized force of select troops functioning as an elite police unit.
They maintained strict public order and acted as the direct enforcers of the caliph's will, circumventing the regular army if necessary.
I want to point out a very specific administrative choice that Umayyads made here. When they conquered these vast territories from the Byzantine and Sassanid empires, they didn't just sweep away the existing bureaucratic structures.
No, they didn't replace everyone with Arab administrators.
They pragmatically retained the Byzantine and Sassanid bureaucrats who already knew how the local systems worked.
That is correct. The Arab conquerors initially lacked the localized administrative expertise to manage the complex agrarian economies of Egypt, Syria, and Persia.
The sources mention figures like John of Damascus, a prominent Christian theologian, serving as a high-level advisor and administrator for the Umayyad court.
And early on, the state records weren't even kept in Arabic.
Right. The ledgers in the west were kept in Greek, and the records in the east were kept in Pahlavi, the Persian language.
The retention of this local administrative expertise was absolutely essential.
The Umayyad state required immense revenue to function, specifically the Kharaj, which is the land tax, and the jizya, the poll tax on non-Muslims.
The local Christian and Persian bureaucrats possessed the cadastral surveys. They knew who owned which plots of land, and they knew how to assess the harvests.
It kind of reminds me of a modern corporate merger.
How so?
Well, you have a new executive board, the Umayyads, who execute a hostile takeover of a massive company.
Right.
But they are smart enough to look at the middle management, the Christian and Persian bureaucrats, and say, keep doing exactly what you have been doing.
That is a very functional way to look at it. They leave the middle management in place to ensure the company keeps running and generating revenue without missing a single quarter.
The Umayyads understood that ideological purity in administration was way less important than efficiency.
And this highly organized, albeit culturally mixed bureaucracy generated the immense revenue and logistical support required to fund their military machine.
Once the internal administration was stabilized, the caliphate transitioned from consolidation to grand strategy and maximum expansion.
And that expansion involved taking the conflict directly to the Byzantines.
But they didn't just push across the land borders in Anatolia, they took the fight to the sea.
The sources credit Muawiyah with creating the very first Islamic navy.
Which is fascinating. How does a dynasty with roots in the landlocked desert trade of Mecca suddenly build a naval armada capable of threatening the Byzantine Empire?
Well, they leveraged the resources of their conquered territories.
Just as they utilized Byzantine accountants to run the treasury, they utilized Coptic Christians in Egypt and Syrian Christians along the Levantine coast to build and man their fleets.
These populations had centuries of maritime tradition.
The Umayyads provided the capital, the strategic direction, and the Arab military commanders, while the local populations provided the naval engineering and the sailors.
This new naval capacity allowed them to launch massive, multi-year sieges directly against the Byzantine capital, Constantinople.
The historical records detail two major sustained attempts to take Constantinople.
The first occurred from 674 to 678, and the second from 716 to 717.
And these were not mere raids. These operations involved gargantuan fleets and attempted to establish complete blockades of the city to starve it into submission.
But they fail. The Umayyads are ultimately forced to abandon the sieges.
What breaks the blockades?
A combination of geographic, meteorological, and technological factors.
Constantinople is situated on the Bosporus, surrounded by strong currents that made maintaining a static naval blockade exceptionally difficult.
The region also experienced harsh winters that decimated the Umayyad troops encamped outside the walls, leading to outbreaks of plague and starvation in the besieging camps.
And then there's the technological wild card. The sources highlight the Byzantine deployment of a weapon known as Greek fire.
Yes, Greek fire was a highly combustible incendiary liquid.
The exact chemical composition remains a historical mystery, but it was likely a petroleum-based mixture.
The Byzantines developed a system to project this liquid from tubes mounted on the prows of their ships.
It is essentially an 8th century flamethrower.
Exactly. And the most terrifying aspect of Greek fire was that it could burn on water.
So when the Byzantine galleys sprayed this onto the wooden Umayyad ships, it was devastating. Water could not extinguish it.
The combination of Greek fire destroying the fleets, the brutal winters, and sudden, devastating storms that wrecked the retreating ships forced the Umayyads to concede that Constantinople was, for the time being, impregnable.
So the expansion in the north is halted. But while the Byzantine walls held, the Umayyad western expansion was breaking completely through its boundaries.
Let's look at the Maghreb, which is modern-day North Africa.
The campaign in the Maghreb was grueling and protracted.
The Umayyad commanders, most notably Uqa ibn Nafi, pushed westward across the deserts and coastal plains.
Uqa is credited with establishing the garrison city of Kairouan in modern Tunisia, which served as the crucial forward operating base for further western expansion.
But they weren't just fighting the remnants of Byzantine authority there. They faced massive resistance from the indigenous Berber populations.
The sources specifically mention a fiercely resistant local leader known as the Berber Queen Kahina.
The Berber resistance was formidable because it utilized asymmetrical, scorched earth tactics.
Queen Kahina led a coalition of Berber tribes that successfully defeated the Umayyad forces in several major engagements,
temporarily halting the Arab advance.
However, the Umayyads possessed deeper logistical reserves.
They regrouped, utilized the wealth of Kairouan to supply fresh armies, and eventually defeated Kahina.
And crucially, they integrated the Berber tribes into the Umayyad military structure.
That integration proves vital because it leads directly to the year 711.
This is a massive turning point in world history.
A largely Berber army, commanded by Tariq ibn Ziyad, crosses the Strait of Gibraltar and lands in Hispania, modern-day Spain.
Tariq's crossing in 711 initiated the conquest of the Visigothic kingdom.
The Visigoths were ruling the Iberian Peninsula at the time, but their state was deeply fractured by internal political disputes and succession crises.
Tariq capitalized on this instability. He met the Visigothic king Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete.
And Roderick is completely defeated. The Visigothic kingdom just unravels.
The speed of that conquest is staggering.
It was incredibly rapid. Within a few short years, the Umayyad forces had captured Toledo, the capital, and brought nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula under their control.
They utilized the highly mobile Berber cavalry to bypass heavily fortified areas and strike deeply into the peninsula.
And they don't even stop at the Pyrenees Mountains.
No, the Umayyads push into Gaul, which is modern-day France.
They conducted extensive raiding and expansion into southern Gaul.
Their advance in Western Europe was only definitively halted in the year 732.
When the Frankish leader Charles Martel defeated the Umayyad forces at the Battle of Poitiers, also known as the Battle of Tours.
This engagement set the northern boundary of the Islamic expansion in Europe.
So that is the Western Front. Yet simultaneously, on the exact opposite side of the known world, the Umayyads are expanding eastward into Central Asia and India.
The eastern campaigns were equally ambitious.
You have the commander Qutayba ibn Muslim leading forces deep into Transoxiana.
He successfully captured major, heavily fortified Silk Road cities like Bukhara and Samarkand.
This brought the Umayyad Caliphate into direct contact with the frontiers of the Chinese Tang dynasty.
And right around the exact same time Tariq is crossing into Spain in 711, there is another major campaign launching into the Indian subcontinent.
The sources detail the invasion of Sind, led by a commander named Muhammad bin al-Qasim, who was incredibly only 17 years old at the time.
Muhammad bin al-Qasim's campaign into Sind is a masterclass in 8th century logistics.
To conquer the fortified cities along the Indus River Valley, he didn't just rely on cavalry.
The sources describe his utilization of sophisticated riverine logistics, bringing supplies up the rivers on boats.
And deploying heavy siege equipment, including massive catapults operated by hundreds of men to breach the city walls.
The sources also address the social and religious impact of this eastern expansion, particularly the treatment of the largely Buddhist populations in Central Asia.
Right, the advance into Central Asia brought the Islamic State into regions dominated by Buddhism and Zoroastrianism.
The historical records mention the destruction of Buddhist monasteries and shrines during the initial conquests.
However, over time, the socioeconomic pressures of living under Umayyad rule, coupled with the loss of institutional support for the monasteries, led to widespread, gradual conversions to Islam among the local populations in Transoxiana.
So I want to look at the map for a second.
Okay.
You have forces fighting the Franks in France and forces utilizing river catapults in India. With an empire stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indus River, covering 15 million square kilometers, how does the central government in Damascus even function?
It is a massive challenge.
Didn't the absolute logistical limits of 8th century communication make a territory of this scale fundamentally ungovernable?
That is the precise existential challenge the Umayyads faced as the conquest slowed down. The geographic distances were staggering.
A message sent via the Birid relay system from Damascus could take weeks or even months to reach the frontiers in Spain or Sind.
The caliph could not physically be present to enforce his authority or monitor the tax collectors.
So how do you hold it together when you can't be there?
To visually and economically unify this vastly stretched territory, the Umayyad administration realized they needed standardized symbols of power.
They needed to replace the localized, polyglot multi-currency system they had inherited from the Romans and Persians with a unified, instantly recognizable Islamic identity.
The population needed to see the state.
This was achieved through sweeping reforms in language, money, and monuments.
Let's start with language, because the Arabization of the state feels like the linchpin for everything else.
In the year 697, Caliph Abd al-Malik issues a sweeping mandate.
He decrees that all imperial records, from the tax ledgers in Egypt to the military rolls in Persia, must switch from Greek and Pahlavi to Arabic.
This was a monumental administrative decision.
By mandating Arabic for all official state business, Abd al-Malik cemented it as the lingua franca of administration and commerce across 3 continents.
It forced the local bureaucrats who wanted to keep their jobs to learn the language of the conquerors,
thereby standardizing the reporting process for the central treasury in Damascus.
It is brilliant because suddenly the caliph or his viziers can actually audit the books from anywhere in the empire without needing an interpreter.
It centralizes fiscal oversight.
And this shift to Arabic is immediately accompanied by a total overhaul of the economic systems.
The empire relied heavily on two main taxes: the Kharaj, which was a tax on agricultural land, and the Jizya, which was a specific poll tax levied on non-Muslim subjects.
Who were referred to as dhimmis.
To standardize the collection of the Kharaj and the Jizya across such a fragmented economic landscape, Abd al-Malik introduced a momentous coinage reform.
Prior to this, the empire was functioning on a confusing mix of leftover Byzantine gold coins and Sassanid silver coins, which often varied in weight and purity.
In 696, Abd al-Malik minted the very first purely Islamic gold dinar.
This was followed 2 years later, in 698, by the introduction of the silver dirham.
And the sources note these weren't just new coins thrown into circulation, they were heavily and strictly regulated.
The gold dinar was mandated to have an exact standardized weight of 4.25 grams.
The silver dirham was strictly regulated at 2.97 grams.
This standardization builds trust in the currency from Spain to India.
But the most visible, striking change was the design of the coins themselves.
The design shift was a profound ideological statement.
The previous modified coins featured pictures of Byzantine emperors holding crosses or Sassanid kings wearing elaborate crowns.
Abd al-Malik removed all figural imagery entirely. He replaced the portraits with pure text.
Specifically, Arabic inscriptions drawn directly from the Quran.
By replacing images of human rulers with the text of God, the Umayyads are projecting a very specific worldview.
They were asserting a distinct Islamic identity that adhered to emerging aniconic principles.
Which is the theological avoidance of depicting sentient beings, particularly in religious or state contexts.
These coins functioned as circulating mass media.
Every time a merchant in Bukhara or a soldier in Cordoba made a transaction, they were holding a physical declaration of Umayyad sovereignty and the supremacy of the Islamic faith.
This exact same ideology, using aniconic text to project power, was simultaneously being projected on a massive, permanent scale through monumental architecture.
And there is no better example of this than the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which was completed in 692 by Caliph Abd al-Malik.
The Dome of the Rock is an absolute architectural marvel.
It sits prominently on the Temple Mount, the site of the former Jewish temple.
Structurally, it utilizes a sophisticated octagonal design,
The octagon was specifically chosen to facilitate circumambulation.
allowing pilgrims to walk in circles around the central rock.
It is crowned with a brilliant double-shell wooden dome, which is an engineering feat that reduces weight and protects the interior decorations from the elements.
The interior is just staggering. It is decorated with millions of gold and glass tesserae forming intricate mosaics.
But again, just like the new gold dinars, there are 0 human figures depicted anywhere.
Instead, the building utilizes extensive, monumental Arabic inscriptions running along the arcades.
And those inscriptions are not just random verses, they are a highly targeted theological argument.
The text explicitly challenges Christian Trinitarianism.
The sources note they include verses stating, God is one, he does not beget, nor is he begotten.
They are physically pushing back against the foundational doctrines of Christianity right in the middle of a heavily Christian city.
The placement and the messaging were incredibly strategic.
Jerusalem was filled with monumental Christian architecture, most notably the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
The Dome of the Rock, with its gleaming golden dome and anti-Trinitarian text, was meant to visibly trump the Christian structures.
It was a loud, permanent announcement of the supremacy of the new Islamic State.
Now, some of the historical sources also bring up an alternative, highly political theory regarding why Abd al-Malik built it.
They suggest it was constructed to actively divert the annual pilgrimage, the Hajj, away from Mecca.
Yes, that theory is rooted in the internal politics of the time.
During the construction of the Dome of the Rock, Mecca was actually controlled by a rival claimant to the caliphate, a man named Ibn al-Zubayr.
The theory posits that Abd al-Malik built a magnificent sanctuary in Jerusalem to provide an alternative pilgrimage site for his Syrian subjects.
Ensuring their wealth and religious devotion did not flow into the territory of his political rival.
Whether the primary motive was theological supremacy or political diversion, the architectural program set a clear blueprint.
And it continued under Abd al-Malik's son, Caliph al-Walid I.
He takes this monumental building program to the capital and builds the Great Mosque of Damascus.
The construction of the Great Mosque required the demolition of the existing Basilica of St. John the Baptist, which had itself been built on a Roman temple to Jupiter.
Al-Walid replaced the basilica with a colossal mosque that heavily featured Byzantine-style mosaics.
However, adhering to the new state identity, these mosaics depicted idyllic landscapes, massive trees, and elaborate architecture, but they were completely devoid of human or animal figures.
It is remarkable to look at this period. You can read the physical landscape of the cities and the coins in people's pockets as early forms of mass communication, broadcasting a new religious and political identity to millions of subjects.
But broadcasting a unified identity from the capital does not mean the population was actually united.
Right, underneath this polished, standardized surface of gold domes and silver coins, deep theological and social fractures were slowly tearing the empire apart from the inside.
The fractures began at the very top of the social hierarchy, concerning the foundational nature of succession.
When Muawiyah I decided to name his son Yazid as his successor, he explicitly violated the traditional principle of shura, or consultation by the community leaders.
This action fundamentally changed how the Umayyads were viewed.
It earned the dynasty the derogatory title of Malik.
Malik translates to worldly kings. Calling the caliph a Malik was a severe insult.
It implied that the Umayyads were no longer ruling by Islamic mandate or communal consensus, but were simply secular monarchs passing power down bloodlines like the Roman or Persian emperors before them.
This hereditary crisis directly precipitated one of the most traumatic and defining events in Islamic history.
The massacre at Karbala.
I want to slow down and look closely at Karbala, because the ripples from this event shaped the entire region to this day.
In October 680, which corresponds to the Islamic month of Muharram in the year 61, Hussein, who is the son of Ali and the direct grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, refuses to accept Yazid's hereditary succession.
Hussein decides to travel toward the city of Kufa in Iraq to gather his supporters and challenge the regime.
But Hussein never reached Kufa.
He and his small caravan were intercepted in the desert at a place called Karbala by a vastly superior Umayyad military force.
The Umayyad commander demanded Hussein's surrender and allegiance to Yazid.
When Hussein refused, the Umayyad forces cut off the caravan's access to water for several days.
The ensuing event is described in the sources as an absolute slaughter.
Hussein and approximately 70 of his male companions and family members were systematically killed in battle.
And to finalize the terror, Hussein's head was severed and paraded on a spear through the streets as a warning to anyone else who might challenge Umayyad authority.
The sources emphasize that Karbala ended an age of innocence for the early Muslim community.
The psychological shock that the ruling government, the state claiming to lead the Islamic world, would ruthlessly slaughter the Prophet's own grandson was unfathomable.
It is a trauma that fundamentally changes the political landscape.
It catalyzed the formalization of the Shia tradition.
The partisans of Ali, known as the Shia to Ali, began to transition from being a purely political faction advocating for Ali's bloodline into a distinct religious movement.
This movement centered on the deep veneration of the Imams, the descendants of Ali, and the perpetual mourning of the martyrs of Karbala.
The shedding of Hussein's blood provided a powerful, emotive rallying cry against Umayyad legitimacy.
And it inspired continued rebellions. The sources mention the Zaydis, or the Fivers, who followed a descendant named Zayd ibn Ali.
Rather than accept the quietist approach of some other Shia leaders, Zayd chose to actively rebel and died in battle against the Umayyads in 740.
The legacy of Karbala meant the Umayyads were constantly fighting off armed insurrections claiming to represent true justice.
This constant political division rapidly fueled a massive theological debate within the empire.
It centered on the concepts of free will versus predestination.
The Umayyad government heavily favored and patronized a theological group known as the Jabrites.
The Jabrites were the proponents of absolute predestination. Let's explore the mechanics of that debate. Why does a medieval government care about the theological nuances of predestination?
Because it offered the ultimate political shield.
The Jabrites argued that because God is omnipotent, he decrees absolutely everything that happens on earth.
Therefore, the Umayyad state argued that their rule, no matter how oppressive, violent, or corrupt it might seem, was installed directly by the will of God.
They argued that rebelling against the Umayyad Caliph was not just treason, it was a sin against God's explicit decree.
Basically, God put us here, so deal with it.
Precisely. On the other side of the debate, you had the Proto-Shiites and a group known as the Qadarites, who argued fiercely for free will.
They insisted that humans choose their own actions, and that God is fundamentally just and would not decree tyranny.
Therefore, if a ruler is unjust, He is acting on his own free will, not God's decree, which logically and morally justifies rebelling against him.
This theological debate over justice was inextricably linked to profound systemic social inequalities within the empire.
As the Umayyads expanded across those 15 million square kilometers, thousands of non-Arabs converted to Islam.
These non-Arab converts were known as the Mawali.
According to fundamental Islamic principles, all Muslims belong to a single, equal brotherhood.
However, the Umayyad state was rigidly structured around an Arab elite.
The Mawali, whether they were Persians in the east or Berbers in the west, were treated distinctly as second-class citizens.
The sources point to a very specific structural form of discrimination regarding taxation.
Local governors often forced the Mawali to continue paying the jizya. Now, the jizya is the poll tax strictly designated for non-Muslims.
Why on earth would the state tax its own converts as if they hadn't converted?
It came down to mathematics and revenue.
The state budget and the military stipends were calculated based on the massive influx of the jizya.
When large populations converted to Islam, they theoretically became exempt from that tax.
The local governors realized that if they acknowledged all these conversions, the treasury would collapse.
So they pragmatically and illegally, under Islamic law, continued to levy the jizya on the Mawali.
Furthermore, the sources note that the Mawalis were frequently denied equal stipends in the military, even when fighting alongside Arab troops.
They were paying the taxes of the conquered, but dying in the armies of the conquerors.
This bred deep structural resentment, particularly in the eastern provinces like Khorasan, where the Persian Mawali had a long, proud history of administration and warfare.
The contradiction was glaring. You have a government using the theology of predestination to demand obedience while simultaneously exploiting the very religious converts they claim to champion.
So what does this all mean for the stability of the state?
How does the economy not completely collapse under the weight of this massive contradiction? If you punish people for converting, eventually they stop working or they start rebelling.
It nearly did collapse. The tension between the ideological claims of the Islamic State and the practical, often exploitative revenue demands of the ruling Arab elite created an unsustainable pressure cooker.
This systemic crisis is exactly why one specific caliph had to implement sweeping, emergency economic and social reforms to save the state from imploding completely.
That brings us to the reign of Umar ibn Abdulaziz, widely known in history as Umar II.
He ruled for a very brief period, only 2.5 years, from 717 to 720.
But his impact on the structure of the state was so profound that he is often viewed as a reformist outlier among the Umayyad kings.
Umar II possessed a keen understanding of both Islamic jurisprudence and statecraft.
He recognized that the discriminatory policies against the Mawali were both morally indefensible and politically disastrous.
If the state did not alleviate the pressure on the provincial populations, the rebellions would tear the empire apart.
He initiated immediate fiscal and social restructuring.
What were the mechanics of his reforms? Where did he start?
He started by directly addressing the primary grievance of the Mawali. He outright abolished all non-Sharia taxes that had been invented by local governors to squeeze the populace.
Most importantly, he issued an empire-wide decree that all Muslim converts, regardless of their ethnicity, were completely exempt from the jizya.
But as we discussed, the state relied on that jizya revenue. If he exempts millions of people from the poll tax, how does he prevent the treasury from going bankrupt?
To compensate for the lost revenue, he fundamentally restructured the kharaj, the land tax.
Previous administrations had demanded fixed, crushing rates of taxation, regardless of the actual agricultural yield.
If a drought hit, a farmer still owed the same amount of gold, which forced many into debt or caused them to abandon their lands entirely.
Umar II instituted a proportional system. The tax was based on the actual agricultural productivity of the land.
So if you have a bad harvest, your tax burden is lower, you survive the winter, you stay on your land, and you produce again next year.
It incentivizes the agrarian economy rather than destroying it.
Precisely. He also completely overhauled the welfare system by optimizing the collection and distribution of zakat, the mandatory Islamic alms.
He centralized this process through the Bait al-Mal, the public treasury.
The historical sources make a rather striking claim about his handling of the zakat.
They state that the wealth redistribution was so effective that state officials reportedly traveled through provinces struggling to find eligible recipients for the charity, because extreme poverty had been so drastically reduced.
While there may be some hagiographical exaggeration in those accounts, the underlying economic reality is sound.
If we connect this to modern macroeconomic principles, Umar II's policies were highly sophisticated.
He was acting much like a modern central bank balancing fiscal policy.
He understood that extracting maximum revenue in the short term destroys the tax base in the long term.
By implementing systematic wealth redistribution, he alleviated structural poverty, which in turn stimulated local economies and increased overall productivity.
He didn't just stop at taxation. He also took aggressive steps toward monetary stabilization.
The sources mention he issued strict regulations prohibiting the hoarding of dinars and dirhams. Let's look at that. Why is hoarding coins a threat to state security?
Because it drains liquidity from the market.
In an economy reliant on physical specie gold and silver, if the wealthy elites hoard massive amounts of coins in their personal vaults, it creates an artificial scarcity of money.
This leads to deflation, where the value of money rises, making debts harder to pay and stifling trade.
By forcing the coinage back into circulation, Umar II maintained the money supply and kept the wheels of commerce turning.
To keep trade flowing smoothly across such a vast territory without physically moving tons of silver, the administration under Umar II also saw the increased use of non-cash payment systems.
Merchants began utilizing sacks, which were early forms of checks and promissory notes.
This innovation eliminated the immense physical danger of transporting heavy physical gold across the 15 million square kilometers of the empire.
A merchant in Damascus could write a note that could be cashed by a partner in Bukhara.
Umar II's reforms successfully demonstrated what a just, equitable Umayyad state could look like.
By aligning state policy with Islamic egalitarian principles, he briefly restored public trust and began to unify the deeply fractured society.
However, his reign was simply too short.
He dies in 720, and the subsequent caliphs don't maintain his systems.
They do not. The Arab elite, whose personal wealth and privileges had been curtailed by Umar II's equitable tax policies, pressured the subsequent caliphs to revert to the old exploitative fiscal models.
They reinstated the discriminatory taxes on the mawali to enrich the central treasury.
This reversion paved the way for total systemic collapse.
That collapse materializes a few decades later in what historians call the Third Fitna.
The empire was physically exhausted from the constant frontier warfare against the Byzantines and the Khazars. The treasury was drained.
And the ruling Arab elite, rather than uniting to face these challenges, were tearing themselves apart through bitter, deep-seated tribal rivalries.
The sources specifically highlight the feud between the Qays and Yaman tribal confederations.
The Qays and Yaman factions represented a massive polarization of the Arab military caste.
Governors and caliphs would purge the administration based on these tribal affiliations, creating a cycle of vengeance and instability at the very core of the state.
This internal fragmentation, combined with an exhausted treasury, provided the perfect opportunity for an organized, ideological opposition to finally strike.
This opposition coalesces into the Abbasid Revolution.
And the Abbasids are strategically brilliant because they capitalize on every single fault line the Umayyads had spent decades creating.
The Abbasids constructed a massive coalition of the disgruntled.
They harnessed the long-simmering anger of the Mawali, who deeply resented their reversion to second-class status.
They allied with the Shia, who still demanded justice for the massacre at Karbala and believed leadership should belong to the Prophet's family.
And they launched their organized rebellion from the eastern province of Khorasan, utilizing the formidable military skills of the Persian and Arab settlers there who felt ignored by the elites in Damascus.
The Abbasid forces, marching under black banners, systematically roll back Umayyad control from east to west.
This culminates in the decisive defeat and overthrow of the last Umayyad Caliph, Marwan II, at the Battle of the Zab in the year 750.
Marwan II fled to Egypt, where he was eventually hunted down and killed.
The Abbasids did not just intend to take the throne, they were determined to ensure the Umayyads could never, ever return to challenge them.
They systematically hunted down and massacred nearly the entire Umayyad extended family.
It is a brutal, absolute eradication of the dynasty in the Middle East. But the story of the Umayyads does not end with the slaughter in Syria.
Against all statistical odds, one single member of the royal family survives.
Abba Rahman I, who is the grandson of Caliph Hisham, manages a harrowing escape.
Abd al-Rahman's survival is one of the most remarkable stories of the era. He fled Syria as a young man, dodging Abbasid assassins for years.
He crossed the harsh deserts of North Africa, seeking refuge among the Berber tribes, as his mother was of Berber descent.
He eventually crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Al-Andalus.
The Iberian Peninsula that Tariq ibn Ziyad had conquered for the Umayyads decades earlier.
He lands in a territory completely fractured by its own civil wars, and through sheer political will and military acumen, he unites it.
In 756, Abd al-Rahman established the Emirate of Cordoba.
And his descendants would later elevate that emirate into a full caliphate.
This Umayyad state in Spain survived for centuries, operating completely independent of and in direct rivalry with the Abbasid Empire in the east.
It became a beacon of the Islamic Golden Age. The Umayyads transformed Cordoba into a leading global center for science, medicine, philosophy, and monumental architecture, rivaling or surpassing any city in contemporary Europe.
It is a profound historical irony. The dynasty that built the massive Islamic empire in the Middle East loses its homeland completely.
Syria is gone. Damascus is lost.
But its sole survivor manages to recreate the glory of his ancestors on the absolute furthest edge of the known world in Spain.
To summarize the vast, complex legacy of the Umayyads in the East, despite their highly controversial rise to power and their incredibly violent end, they accomplished something monumental.
They successfully transformed a localized Arabian faith and a tribal society into a global, highly organized bureaucratic empire.
They established the administrative, linguistic, and architectural blueprints, from the complex intelligence networks of the Diwans to the Golden Dome over Jerusalem, that would irrevocably shape the political and cultural landscape of the entire medieval world.
We want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Consider the Arabic language itself.
As we discussed, it was mandated and standardized by Caliph Abd al-Malik in 697 purely for administrative tax efficiency.
The state just needed a way to read the ledgers from Egypt to Persia to ensure the governors weren't stealing the revenue.
But by standardizing the language across 15 million square kilometers, the Umayyads inadvertently laid the groundwork for something much larger.
That standardized Arabic became the linguistic infrastructure for the massive translation movement that followed under later empires.
It became the vehicle through which ancient Greek philosophy, Persian statecraft, and Indian mathematics were preserved, expanded upon, and eventually transmitted to the rest of the world.
Think about that the next time you look at modern bureaucratic forms or linguistic standards. Consider how many of our global systems of knowledge today have their distant foundational origins in ancient taxation needs. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.